This program is one of a series which accompanies the General Electric LM2500 instructions for the replacement of the inlet gearbox and is designed as a supplement to the printed work package found in the maintenance manual. The inlet gearbox is located behind the A sump cover, mounted to the front frame of the LM2500 gas turbine. Before the inlet gearbox may be replaced, the radial drive shaft and the center body must be removed. If a marine model of the LM2500 is used, also remove the inlet screen. When the center body has been removed, take the sump cover from the front frame. Save these bolts for installation later. Remove and discard the O-ring from the sump cover. Then clean the area around the 6 o'clock opening inside the frame by wiping it with a clean cloth. Completely seal this opening with masking tape to prevent foreign material from entering the frame strut or the transfer gearbox. Next, remove the 2 bolts, the cover plate, and the gasket from the gearbox oil pad at the 4 o'clock position, forward looking aft. Retain these bolts, the cover plate, and the gasket. Now loosen the 12 bolts that secure the gearbox aft flange to the front frame. Use a standard wrench and an extension to loosen these bolts a few turns at a time. Be aware that there are 25 bolts in the aft flange of the inlet gearbox. 12 bolts secure the gearbox to the front frame, and 13 of the bolts are in the clearance holes. Do not loosen any of the bolts in the clearance holes because these bolts secure the number 3 bearing. When the 12 bolts are loose, support the gearbox by hand and remove these bolts. Remove the gearbox by pulling it straight forward off of the compressor rotor front shaft. When the inlet gearbox is off, remove it from the inlet plenum area. Then remove and discard the O-ring from the oil supply tube located inside the frame at the 4 o'clock position, forward looking aft. The removal of the inlet gearbox is complete. Before installing a new inlet gearbox, thoroughly inspect the sump area inside the front frame. Make sure that the area is free of all foreign material and that the strut is sealed off with masking tape. First, lubricate and install a new O-ring onto the bearing oil supply tube, located inside the frame at the 4 o'clock position, forward looking aft. Next, a series of drop measurements must be taken. Measure drop A from the sump cover flange to the gearbox mounting flange at 3 equally spaced places. Use a depth micrometer and a parallel bar. Mark the 3 bolt hole locations where drops are taken and record the drop values by location. Measure drop B from the gearbox bearing cover to the aft side of the gearbox mounting flange. Make the measurements at bolt holes corresponding to the bolt holes where drop A was taken. Record the values at each location. Then calculate drop C at each of the 3 locations. This is done by subtracting the value of drop B from drop A. Record the 3 calculated drops by location. Next, clean the splines of the compressor rotor shaft and the gearbox shaft with a clean, lint-free cloth and solvent Mil C5564A or PD680 Type 2. Wipe off the excess solvent with a clean, lint-free cloth. Coat the splines lightly with gas turbine lube oil. Make sure that the number 3 bearing oil nozzle is installed and safety wired to the aft side of the gearbox. Check for the presence of the radial drive shaft upper retaining ring inside the inlet gearbox. If not already in place, the upper retaining ring may be installed by compressing the ring and inserting it into the radial drive shaft opening using hand pressure only. Apply a thin coating of gas turbine lube oil to the overall surface of the gearbox. Now, position the inlet gearbox so that the dowel pin in the aft flange is at approximately the 7 o'clock position forward looking aft. Carefully place the gearbox into the frame, aligning the dowel pin to the hole in the frame mounting flange, and align the oil tube pad to the oil supply tube. Then align the splines of the gearbox shaft with the splines of the compressor rotor shaft, and carefully seat the gearbox onto the mounting flange, being sure that the oil tube engages the gearbox properly. Visually inspect to make sure that the gearbox rear flange is seated. Do not use excessive force to seat the gearbox because spline damage could result. If the gearbox does not fit into place properly, contract it by packing it in dry ice for a minimum of 20 minutes. Next, loosely install the 12 bolts and washers around the gearbox flange with a socket and extension wrench. Tighten these bolts using a crisscross pattern. Torque them each to 55 to 70 inch-pounds. Now, measure the actual drop C from the sump cover flange to the forward face of the gearbox at each marked location. Compare each actual drop C with its corresponding calculated drop C. The measured drop must be within plus or minus 0.02 of an inch of the calculated drop at each location. If the drop does not meet these limits, remove the gearbox, inspect for dirt, high metal, or similar problems, and repeat the installation procedure, including the drop checks. When the inlet gearbox is seated properly, install the cover plate and the gasket onto the oil pad opening on the forward side of the inlet gearbox. Secure it with 2 bolts. Torque these bolts to 55 to 70 inch-pounds. Make sure that the sump area is free of all foreign material. Remove the masking tape from the sump strut opening and wipe the area with a clean cloth. Wipe the sump cover with a clean cloth and a solvent. Install a new lubricated O-ring into the groove of the sump cover. Then position the sump cover on the front flange of the frame. Align the bolt holes and install the 10 bolts. Torque each bolt to 55 to 70 inch-pounds. When the inlet gearbox has been installed, the center body, the radial drive shaft, and if applicable, the inlet screen may be reinstalled. Make sure that the inlet pump area is free of all foreign material and perform the idle power operational check in accordance with the maintenance manual. This completes the replacement of the inlet gearbox. For a review of this procedure, refer to the printed work package on this subject found in the maintenance manual for the General Electric Marine and Industrial LM2500 gas turbine.